COVID-19 is obviously one of the greatest present challenges to face the world in recent time. And I had a pretty hard time sitting back to relax during my quarantine spring break. While there were many challenges that needed to be solved, due to the respiratory nature of this disease, patients with COVID-19 that become hospitalized will commonly need mechanical ventilation to assist their lungs in breathing. So during the preliminary stages of COVID-19, highly population dense areas such as New York City and select locations in Italy were faced with a really large demand for patient treatment. There were some hospitals in Italy where they were reaching a point such that patients would even be denied care simply because of the lack of ventilator availability. So this was not the ideal way for patients to be treated for COVID-19, and it was being caused because of this ventilator shortage. So obviously, the natural question that presented itself was, what is the root cause of this ventilator shortage in places like Italy? There's really two primary facets to answer this question. The first being that the amount of patients being admitted to hospitals, and the second being that the criteria that doctors were using to place patients under invasive mechanical ventilation. So firstly, it's clear COVID-19 is very infectious. 1 in 6 of every hospitalized patient will become severely ill and possibly require invasive mechanical ventilation. So invasive ventilation is demonstrated by this photo in the bottom right, where essentially an endotracheal tube is placed within the patient. So doctors were opting to do this early because of the ability of that method to reduce the amount of aerosolized COVID-19 particles in the air. However, it would have been sufficient to use a non-invasive method like this nasal cannula method shown here to actually bring back patients in terms of their recovery of the disease. So it's vital that our medical staff remain safe in fighting the pandemic, but it's also important that all of the COVID-19 patients can receive the care they need to get better. So this is essentially where my team at Berkeley came into play. So just for reference, at the beginning of March, the World Health Organization said COVID-19 is an official global pandemic. And then shortly after that, in the month of March, UC Berkeley formed what is now known as the Ventilator SOS Response Team. So it all really began when Brian Martell, a retired professional engineer who graduated from Berkeley, approached the university, and he had an idea. He said that I have this household device, it's called a sleep apnea machine, and it could potentially prove to be the foundation of an emergency ventilator. So from his outreach to the university, he got Professor Grace O'Connell involved to recruit a team of technical engineering students and doctors from around the world, mostly in San Francisco Bay Area. And then this is where I initially got involved. So the team was initially only 3 students. It was myself, Josh, and X. However, as the project grew, I became the engineering lead for all of the undergraduate and graduate students who got involved with this project. But ultimately, we are a team of engineers, medical doctors, and pulmonologists to put together this solution. So we combined the technical hardware experience of mechanical engineers and the medical expertise of doctors to really get a fast running start to solving this problem. So in terms of the timeline, on March 22nd, we began promptly doing our preliminary design. And I structured our team's design philosophy for this ventilator around a pyramid-like structure, because the emergency ventilator that you're going to use would be absolutely useless if it was not built upon a foundation of safety. So it is imperative that the team provided a solution with similar operating characteristics as that of a mechanical ventilator without causing any sort of barotrauma or pressure trauma to a patient's lungs. So building upon that safety of the device is the system's reliability and functionality. So we needed something that could basically do the same things as a ventilator while being reliable on a day-to-day basis without requiring frequent maintenance, basically. So then building on top of safety, reliability, and functionality is the certification aspects of this project. Without getting national or FDA certification for this device, there was no way that it could possibly provide the legal capacity to be certified and used on a mass scale, which is what ultimately the goal of this project is. So then the final thing, and really one of the main drivers of component selection for this project, was the manufacturability of the system. So we're working on a device that could literally save lives with every minute that is being used. So fundamentally, we could not afford any time with intensive manufacturing methods or spend hours optimizing the theoretical design of some component. We needed something, and we need to do it now or pretty much yesterday, because there were people at risk everywhere in the world. So after we constructed what our general design philosophy was, given the situation of COVID-19, I reached out to a Berkeley alumnus and current pulmonologist, AJ Daria. And essentially, he helped me establish the clinical needs for what this emergency ventilator needed to do. So with his assistance, I was able to document the 4 fundamental needs that the design needed to satisfy. And basically, that is the first of which is the peak flow rate. So this is if a patient needed to take a high volume amount of air in at a very short time interval. So this would be something around 1.5 liters per second. The system must also provide an average flow rate during steady operation of about 15 to 20 liters per minute. So that's if you're just normally breathing commonly without like exercising or something like that. Now it's also possible that a patient might need supplemental oxygen in the airflow. So for this reason, we had to provide anywhere from 20 to 90% oxygen, or the fraction of ingested oxygen into the airflow, so that the blood oxygen content levels of patients could be increased. Finally, one of the most important needs was to limit the intake and release of what's called aerosolized COVID-19 particles. So the transmission of the disease can take place through essentially the air, and we needed to make sure that within this circuit, none of these particles could leave the system and possibly infect a medical personnel who's caring for these patients. So we began our design iteration actually using sleep apnea devices. But we originally wanted something that could be assembled as easily as a set of Legos or maybe IKEA furniture. And this design was very promising. There were commercially accessible components that could be rapidly put together. But we had to take into account all of the other solutions that were being presented at the time to make sure that we were headed down the right path for an emergency ventilator. So although our first design attempt was promising, we considered something that was presented by MIT known as the AmbuBag emergency ventilator system, which utilizes what's known as a bag valve mask system. And it's the diaphragm looking system that you might have seen on the news before. And really, this is what emergency medical technicians would use in the back of an ambulance to provide CPR to a patient. And the MIT design required mechanical actuation of that diaphragm using microcontrollers and control algorithms to essentially push air into the patient's lungs. But according to the Berkeley design philosophy of being able to certify this device, we did not think that we had the time available to certify the control algorithms that would have to go into doing that kind of hardware design. So we moved on, and we found that there was another very promising solution presented by the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. Essentially, their design was very similar to ours in terms of using a sleep apnea device system. However, one fundamental difference was that they used a secondary flow monitoring system, which could tell you what the ratio of gases is in the flow and if there's any carbon dioxide being emitted by the patient to prohibit from them being suffocated in any way. So that's very good, but it's a very expensive process that's not necessarily necessary. And since we wanted this project to grow internationally and there's disparities in healthcare all around the world, we did not think that this complicated flow monitoring system would be something that we could afford to provide to every single hospital that needed it. So we needed to think of something a little bit cheaper. And then finally, we definitely did not overlook the idea of a from scratch system. So if you've been following the news of this ventilator crisis, you've seen that there's some pretty rigorous at-home solutions of people taking their sprinkler systems and using PVC pipes and solenoid valves to push air at the typical cycle that you would see in a breathing process. And these could work, and they definitely do the things that mechanical ventilators do. And there was a great solution presented by the University of Florida Health Center, which used this kind of like fundamental raw materials of creating a ventilator from scratch. But according to the way we wanted to proceed in terms of this rapid manufacturing and distribution, we found that using all these raw materials was not going to be helpful, because this was time that we would otherwise need to be using to certify the device with the FDA in the United States. So after considering all these options, we ended back up at our original design of using a sleep apnea device system and then getting commercially accessible parts that could be repurposed from other systems and assemblies to basically synthesize a new solution that could be used for this emergency ventilation. So if you're anything like me, when I started on this project, I did not know what a sleep apnea device was, but I'm going to provide a little bit of background as to what it is so that you're familiar with how this is actually going to be providing the bread and butter of an emergency ventilator. So they're commonly referred to as BiPAP devices. And the reason why they're called that is because they provide bilevel positive airway pressure. So a BiPAP device is capable of treating the symptoms of sleep apnea, which is when you don't get enough oxygen or air while you're sleeping at night. And it does this by varying levels of positive pressure into a patient's airway. These devices can essentially detect when a patient is exhaling and then lower pressure of airflow going into the patient's respiratory system. And then it can then adjust that whenever the patient or the person using the device is ready for another intake of air. So the best thing about these devices is that there are over 10 million sleep apnea devices scattered throughout the United States for consumer use. And also, really the stars were aligning when the FDA cleared sleep apnea devices as approved emergency ventilators on March 4th. So when we heard about this, we realized we had a lot of momentum, and I think we were heading down the right path. So really, the next steps, once we found that this was going to be how we were going to start our system assembly, I reached out using the Nextdoor app in my neighborhood at the University of California, and I put out the message shown in the top right corner, literally asking people around me. I said, do you have these devices? Can I use them? I'm trying to solve this problem with the University of California. And within minutes, people were willing to donate. So that afternoon, after posting on Nextdoor, I got in my car, I drove around Berkeley, and I picked up people's sleep apnea devices and air hoses off their front porch, and then I dropped it back off in my apartment living room. Because keep in mind, at this time, everything was closed, and I couldn't use any of the facilities that would normally be available to me by the University of California. So this operation really started from my apartment. So once we had all the parts collected, I was able to begin the conceptual design of the assembly using typical engineering CAD software. And so if you've happened to see this project in the news before, this is likely the photo you've seen, which is our initial conceptualization of the idea. And I'll talk a little bit more about what all these parts do in later slides. So with the conceptual design in place, we could start doing the prototyping of the configuration. And like I said earlier, this was a difficult process at first because of campus closures. And eventually, our team actually got elevated access to the university as long as we were being safe and distancing ourselves from one another. So that really leads into the next part of the project, which was prototyping, which was a very experimental but fun process of failing as fast as you possibly can to figure out what's feasible and what is not. So we had members of our team, like in these pictures here, literally breathing through various configurations that we had developed to just see if it was feasible in terms of its use and how comfortable it would actually be for a patient to be using these devices. We commonly attempted to 3D print parts, like the one shown in the bottom right corner. This part was something that we were thinking we could add on to the machine to essentially control the amount of oxygen that's being entered into the system. But we eventually found that there was a commercially accessible part for this anyways, so there was really no need to 3D print in the first place. And this saved us a lot of time for manufacturing down the road. So after tinkering with the design on multiple occasions, the first generation circuit design that we developed is shown here in this exploded plan view drawing. So it looks like a very simple assembly, and that's really one of the most important aspects of it, is that anyone can pick up the instructions for this assembly and be able to put it together. So all of these parts on this system can be accessed either from community donations or from hospital inventories that already exist around the world. So the way this device transports air to the patient is basically this device sucks in air, it goes through an antiviral filter to take out those aerosolized COVID-19 particles. It then goes through an air hose and then into an oxygen bleed port, which is where the hospital could provide additional oxygen if the patient needed it, up into another antiviral filter, which allows for exhalation here. So that way no exhaled air is being emitted with COVID-19 particles. And then up to a catheter mount and an endotracheal tube. So an important characteristic of this design is that all these parts would be rapidly accessible and that they could be used, or all the parts could be accessed with current inventory to prevent inventory shock on the ventilator industry, because there's many other people trying to do this, or there's companies trying to build new ventilators using components, but we knew that if we tried to prevent or to provide a solution like that, there would be a backlog for multiple weeks of components that needed to be used. So we had to use stuff that was already accessible either in the community or in hospitals. So at this time, on the 1st of April, that's really when our team began the concurrent emergency ventilator testing and design. So keep in mind that this is over a 1-month span, and we've been continually collecting new information about how this pandemic is spreading and what people are responding to best in terms of the field and how the virus is treated. So we had to adapt very quickly and essentially test our design while adding design changes to it. So the testing of this system was pretty much broken down into 4 main groups. So all the 4 groups really correlate to those initial clinical needs that we needed to satisfy earlier. The first of which was oxygen concentration testing. So using the facilities of a Berkeley alumni by the name of Glenn Stevick, we were able to use the Berkeley Engineering and Research facilities just down the road, down University Road in Berkeley, where I live. And we're able to use his facilities to test the oxygen concentration when we added oxygen into the flow of the system. So using that test method, we were able to create essentially a calibration curve, or like a manual that a doctor would use if they were trying to help a patient. And it would say, doctor, you need to provide this much oxygen into the system if you want to get this output amount of fraction of ingested oxygen to your patient. So we included that essentially in our assembly instructions for the system. We also validated the flow rate to make sure that we weren't going to provide any sort of barotrauma or pressure trauma to the patient. So we found that our system could go from anywhere from 10 to 40 liters per minute of average airflow rate, which surpassed our design requirements that the pulmonologist said we needed to achieve. And then one of the most interesting and I think helpful tests for us in knowing that this project would be successful in treating patients was using a quick lung resistance, essentially a fake lung that the UCSF Health Center had available. So this, this quick lung allowed us to put our emergency ventilator to the test against a lung that could essentially be compromised by COVID-19. So when your lungs get infected, they can become low, moderate to high stiffness because of the amount of fluids that are being trapped within your lungs. So after performing this test of essentially flowing into this fake lung with stiffness, a respiratory therapist at UCSF said, your design works for the low to moderate stiffness of lung, which is exactly what COVID-19 patients are seeing in the field. So it was really this test for me that made me realize, okay, now we just really need to get this going and out to as many people as possible because it could work. And then I think the last thing that we tested was the smoke visualization testing to make sure that there were no leaks throughout the circuit of our system design, because we did not want any sort of the aerosolized COVID-19 particles exiting the system at a part of the circuit which it was not being filtered. So we used a small smoke gun, and then we could actually detect where any sort of aerosolized leaks were occurring. But our system proved well, and it did not have any leaks. So from this point, we basically finalized our design of the ventilator system. And we learned that because of, like I said, we were gaining information on a day-to-day basis of how patients were responding to therapy. And one of the big things we found was that non-invasive, so not using an endotracheal tube, ventilation with low pressure, which is exactly what this machine is best at doing, was the most successful in treating patients. So the only thing we really had to change, according to this field data, was implementing a full face seal mask. So this is a mask that would go around a patient's face, and it would provide that seal to protect medical personnel from any sort of aerosolized particles. But the fundamental operating filtration and pressure control system is the same as what the Generation 1 device was capable of. So assuming a donated BiPAP device and air hose, which typically come together, you could create this emergency ventilator for $220 to $265, which is a fraction of what a hospital-grade ventilator would be. And during times of emergency, when low-pressure therapy is most successful, this could definitely be a solution that could save thousands of people's lives. So with this, all of this information behind us, in the mid part of April, the team began to collect donations on a larger scale through the establishment of a website. And we began to send kits domestically, and we are now currently working on international kits as well. So the website that we created is called ventilatorsos.com, and it serves two fundamental purposes. The first purpose is to collect donation information from anyone with a sleep apnea device, and they're willing to donate it to the cause. So the donator can fill out a form, submit it, and then we collect it and store it in an inventory database held by the team. And we currently have over 2,400 machines that have been donated for these emergency ventilator kits. And that number is increasingly rising. And really the second purpose of the website is for hospitals to come and reach out to us and say, we need your help. Here's how many machines we need, or we believe that we need, and this is what parts we need. Please send us help. So once we have the donation inventory, the hospital request forms, the Ventilator SOS team can collect all of the necessary parts, package them into a kit, and then send them to hospitals as early as possible. So we've been processing requests, or we've processed requests to 3 US cities, and we're working with 5 countries in Latin America and South America right now to send hundreds of emergency ventilator kits internationally. So assembling the emergency kits was a very simple process because we were able to outfit Dr. O'Connell's lab at Berkeley with BiPAP machines, air hoses, antiviral filters, and all the parts necessary to basically create an assembly line of packing all the parts into a kit. So once we had the bill of materials, all you had to do was go collect all the parts according to what the hospital said they needed, put it into a box, sign your name saying everything is there, it's ready to go, and then address it and then ship it. So using this process, essentially our team has been able to send kits to New York and the University of Miami. And then as of Tuesday this week, our executive team informed me that there were hundreds of kits being requested from Mexico, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Brazil, and Argentina. And really, one of the interesting things that happened in this process is once we shared it with the University of Miami, they went and they shared it with Ecuadorian hospitals. And really, this is the fundamental goal of this project, is that it can be open source and it can just be shared with everyone and it can grow at an unlimited rate to help as many people as possible. So we hope that really more cities will share this idea and it can grow to who knows where and with help as many people as possible. But we don't want it to be constrained by purely our capabilities of distributing. So recently, the project's been growing at a very rapid pace, and it's become really an increasingly logistical challenge and less of a technical challenge. So companies such as Salesforce and Apogee have been involved in taking over the website donation and requesting logistics. And as of this week, our executive team has let me know that they're actually talking with the United States Agency for International Development, or otherwise known as USAID, which previously received $750 million from the federal government to essentially help the efforts internationally abroad for fighting COVID-19. So we are hoping that support from this agency will essentially provide the millions of dollars in funding that would be necessary to aid international countries with our emergency ventilator kit. And so with all of that being said, working on this project has been an absolute privilege, and I have no regrets dedicating the majority of my time from spring break up until now to help develop this solution. I've learned an outstanding amount of lessons with respect to what it really takes to develop a successful solution to a challenging problem. I've listed a few key takeaways on this slide. Basically, the first and most important thing that I thought it really took to make a solution to this problem was to really like overcome your fear. And like on many occasions, my fear of trying to find an easier solution or working on something outside of my comfort zone blinded me from really what was capable of being done. And I learned that really just the earlier I got up to go and try something, the faster I would find a solution. And a compounding lesson learned on top of that is that when you overcome your fear to do something, you embrace all the failures you make in the prototyping, design, and planning processes. So failure is really the guiding force, helping you to push towards the best solution that you can find. But if you stop, then failure will stop pushing towards your destination and you're never going to get there. And the overwhelming support that we received for this project from Berkeley alumni, the community, companies, and anyone looking to help was eye-opening. I mean, during the gloomy days of the pandemic from quarantine, I was continuously reminded that we're all on the same team here to fight COVID-19. I received calls from people in Texas and Kansas, and I received emails from people located all over the world hearing about what we were trying to do. And all they wanted to do was send their 3D printed designs and send their microcontroller control algorithms and everything they wanted to do to help us. And so really, everyone was always making their ideas open source and looking to help as much as possible. And it was like one of those times where everyone just stopped what they were doing and they all just worked together to help. And that was really interesting to see because that's really not common. And then finally, with the 3 previous lessons learned in place, time and time again, I found the most simple solution to my problems was commonly going to be the best solution. And as you can tell by our design, it's fairly simple, and that is for a reason. Um, we think that it can help many people, and there's not a huge learning curve to really pick up an emergency ventilator and be able to help that many people. So it's really a culmination of all these key takeaways that will lead to this successfully developed solution, and hopefully provide assistance for one of the many challenges that are presented by COVID-19 today. And I really can't say thank you enough for allowing me to share this idea with all of you. If you're interested in learning more, please visit our website if you want to donate or just learn more. And if you have any inquiries or you want to ask questions about the project, send me an email or message me on LinkedIn or something, and I would be happy to talk with anyone about it. But I guess now I can take questions from anyone who might have some. But thank you for your time.
Brian, thank you so much. This was so inspiring and informative. We do have some questions that I'm going to ask you. I just saw a Go Bears in the chat, and I'm going to echo that Go Bears just to get started. But so I'm really glad to see that you guys are working with South America and Latin America. We know, especially coming out of Brazil, that there's a massive shortage of supplies and treatment options. So one of the questions that we got was, do you have or did you have Spanish speakers on your team?
So not directly on our university team, but what we do have is essentially an executive team with marketing capabilities, and they reached out to the campus at University of Miami, who have the abilities to essentially bring in those kinds of people to communicate internationally. So essentially, we're in a collaborative effort with University of Miami right now to communicate with those Latin American communities. And as of right now, we don't have anyone specifically on our team that are Spanish speakers right now.
Got it. Here's a great one. Did you encounter any naysayers along the way that thought the challenges would be insurmountable of this project? And if so, how did you get past those?
Yeah, so I think when we were halfway through this project, like right when we had our first prototype done and we were testing for feasibility of how comfortable it was to breathe through one of these devices, we saw, or I saw, an article by NPR kind of dismissing the sleep apnea device solution. And really the reason why they were dismissing it was because of this aerosolization challenge. So we kind of rolled with that punch, and we solved that problem using the full face mask seal. And then we tested it at UCSF to basically validate, saying, this is an emergency solution. It may not be expensive with all the fancy bells and whistles of a hospital grade ventilator, but it can help a compromised lung. And our test at UCSF Health Center really helped to validate that, which is why that respiratory therapist on board was huge in terms of giving us the confidence to overcome all of the naysayers, is saying we have hardcore concrete data saying that this could help.
That's phenomenal. We're big supporters here of data, so.
Yeah.
This next one is, how did you sterilize the donated equipment? So that's actually, I think, a great question.
Yeah, so that is a good question. And basically we had within that assembly line of Dr. O'Connell's lab, we had a sterilization setup where we would basically pull, we had a spray bottle with soap and alcohol, and we would spray down all of the masks that we were receiving, all of the air hoses, and then we would open up the sleep apnea devices. And then once we open up the sleep apnea devices, you can spray down the interior to make sure that all of the passageways that air would be traveling in the pump fan were all sterilized as well. And then for cleaning the hoses, you could actually dip that within like a sink, or if you had like a bathtub. So there was a sink in Dr. O'Connell's lab, and we could sink it, essentially put the devices into the sink with soapy water and then just rinse it out. So it was kind of like one of those steps within our assembly line process.
Phenomenal. And so in that same vein, how often do those antiviral filters at the front and back of the machines need to be changed or cleaned or swapped?
That's a great question. So there was, oh man, I have the numbers in a document somewhere, but basically we projected that we would have to go through about 20 per week per use. So, I mean, basically if you assume that someone's using it for like 2 days, well, I guess it depends on how many machines you have. So if you have one machine, and it also varies on how much the person is actually going to be emitting, like the particles of COVID-19, or if they have secretions that need to be cleaned, that could also affect the rate of change. But basically, we are going under the assumption of just one per day, because it really fits into the process of hospitals. Just every day, change it out. Also, I mean, change it before you move on to a new patient. So really, yeah, one of the biggest costs for this project, which is why we need the USAID support, is to fund the immediate change of all of these filters on a daily basis.
Got it. You spoke a little bit to this, but so have you encountered similar devices, and are there other solutions that you found interesting or feasible, and how are those being used, and are they kind of being able to be distributed at the same rate that you guys are distributing yours?
So I think I discussed a few solutions, and it's to my knowledge that those solutions have not been able. So let me back up a little bit. The first solution that I think a lot of people and a lot of corporations have been considering in terms of emergency ventilators is that ambu-bag mechanical ventilation system. But that kind of approach has not gained as much traction because these are all home contraptions which have not previously been FDA certified. So if you put together a bunch of parts that are all FDA certified, then the FDA certification process of all of those components together is going to be much easier than if you were to start from entirely scratch. And that's really where I think we've been able to cut through a lot of the slack on that end, is because we've had that philosophy from day one. And our design may be simple, but it does all of those things. And so the other solution that exists is the Mount Sinai Hospital solution, which they are using a sleep apnea device. And it's, to my understanding, that their only limitation is the gas flow sensors that they have. And I think that their solutions is less of distributed across the United States and internationally, because they've really just been collecting supplies to help their own hospital in New York City. Also, the big discriminator here of what our project has is the repository of 2,400 machines that are ready to go and can be picked up and sent to wherever they need to go whenever we want, or whenever a hospital needs it. And all of the other solutions need to be either taken to a secondary manufacturing site or manufactured in-house. And we really just wanted to cut out all of that in the process. So I don't know if another solution has really been able to get to this point. But I mean, things are changing on a day-to-day basis. So if there is another solution that's working, that's awesome, because whatever can help.
Yeah, I was noticing that when the folks in Italy were trying to hack some solutions, they were also going with that full face mask. They're actually using a scuba mask. So I think people are just doing whatever they can to find the right solution.
Yeah, yeah, it's getting to a point, especially internationally.
Have you found that once the devices land where they're going, that there is additional troubleshooting support needed, or are they equipped on the ground to kind of put it together and make it work?
That's a good question. You know, um, I'm, I haven't received any sort of like calls from people saying, we've received your device, how do you put it together? And I think we really tried to eliminate that risk as much as possible up front by firstly making the system extremely easy to put together. And then second, we have a rigorous manual saying this is part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, and so on. And this is the configuration they need to be put together. And we share that documentation with every kit that is being sent. So my analogy, like always, who does it the best is like IKEA, you know, like almost everyone can put together their furniture, hopefully without having to call customer service.
Right.
And that was really our goal here too, was that they didn't have to give us a call. And for all I know now, we've been doing a good amount of making it easy enough for everyone to put it together.
That's great. So are those instructions that you send out, have those been translated into other languages, or are those still primarily in English?
Well, so we haven't officially, I mean, this is all happening like right now. So like on Tuesday, we made these international, or we received these international requests. So this is something that our documentation team is working on. But right now it's only in English. And whenever the floodgates open saying this is nationally approved
Yeah,
in Latin America, then, I mean, we're going to be ready to go. So we're getting there.
great. This will be my last question unless I get another one, but what is the appetite, if any, and how are you quantifying results after the fact? So are you trying to gauge impact? What numbers are you using? Are destinations supplying you with information as to how many patients are being helped by these?
So that's a really good question. And we haven't had the capability to really set up the feedback loop yet from hospitals that are using our devices. Um, we're very early in that process. And as of right now, we've only been able to quantify how many are being sent.
Got it.
Um, and so we're really just trying to maximize the amount of kits that are being sent. And we hope that by trying to make that number as large as possible, we can help as many people as possible. But in reality, the most important numerical quantity would be the rate of recovery of people who use the device, because with that value in place, then the more we send, just the more people who are going to see recovery. So we really need to do, I mean, whenever this all cools down, or we have the time to do like clinical trials and actual official documentation, then that's when we'll be able to really nail home how that's going to work. But in terms of the low pressure ventilation solutions, that's proven to be better than 50% in terms of recovery. And that's what we're shooting for, because the intubation method was actually proved to be lower than 50% at around 20%. And so by using the face mask, we're hoping to really up that number of like likelihood to recover when using the device.
Sure. Well, Brian, thank you so much. You've been awesome. I think you did a great job of getting complex ideas over to a non-medical audience. And I thank all of the attendees too as well for your thoughtful questions. And we'll be posting this on our internal channels if we want to share with other ODC folks. So thanks again, Brian. And please follow up with Brian's resources here if you want to learn more or donate.
All right. Thank you so much again. And I hope everyone stays healthy and happy.
Thanks, Brian.